Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marie Campos, and I'm ANCOR's Education Director. Welcome to the second session of the 2018 TASH ANCOR Employment Webinar Series. Our topic today is youth transitions, and our presenters are Taryn Williams from the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, and Dr. Mary Morningstar, a professor in special education at the University of Kansas. Before we dive into today's presentation, just quick housekeeping tips and reminders for our newer attendees. Audio is broadcast through your computer speakers, so if you have difficulty with your audio, please try a couple of things. You can double check the computer speakers settings and connection. The second thing you could try to do is just to refresh your internet access. And last but not least, you can listen by phone. I will provide a call-in number in the chat box that you can use as reference if you have audio issues at some point during today's presentation. And we are going to have time today for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have questions for our presenters, please use the chat function. And then finally, we will distribute the webinar recording and presentation slides after today's session, so please keep an eye out for an email from ANCOR with download instructions when those materials become available. This webinar series is a joint partnership between ANCOR and TASH. For those who are unfamiliar, just quick brief introductions of both our organizations. My organization, ANCOR, is the American Network of Community Options and Resources, and we are based here in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. We are a national nonprofit trade association. We advocate for and support over 1,400 private providers of services and supports for people with disabilities. Our mission here at ANCOR is to advance the ability of our members in supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to fully participate in their communities. And introducing our partners at TASH today is Ruthie Marie Beckwith, who is TASH's Executive Director. Ruthie?
Yes, and thank you, Marie. And I am delighted to be part of this effort this year to and provide employment information out to people. TASH is a national organization as well. We have chapters in 16 states, and we were founded to really focus on helping to identify and provide evidence-based supports for people with significant disabilities, and this is across the lifespan. Our primary focuses as an organization, we wear many hats, but our primary focuses are on human rights, inclusive education, and employment. We really believe that these things will lead to, people living full lives where they are not vulnerable to segregation, abuse, neglect, or institutionalization. And we deeply appreciate the presenters taking part in this series with us today and look forward to sharing out their content.
Thank you so much, Ruthie, and that's a really great segue to introduce briefly our presenters today. As I shared, Taryn Williams leads the youth policy team at ODEP within the U.S. Department of Labor. The youth policy team works with workforce development and education system partners to ensure that all youth, including youth with disabilities, have access to comprehensive transition services to prepare them for post-secondary education and the workplace. Amongst Taryn's other prior experiences, she also previously served on detail assignments as the Associate Director for Public Engagement at the White House and also as a policy advisor at the U.S. Senate Committee for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Taryn's co-presenter today is Dr. Mary Morningstar, who is a professor in special education at the University of Kansas. Through the summer, she is also the director of the Transition Coalition, which is a national center offering online, hybrid, and in-person professional development and resources for secondary special educators and transition practitioners. Dr. Morningstar's research encompasses three interrelated concentrations. The first is college and career readiness for youth with disabilities, teacher education and professional development, and secondary inclusive reform. And we're, as Ruthie shared, we're really delighted that they can join us on today's presentation on youth transition. And with that, time, I'd like to turn this over to you to talk about the federal overview, please.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you again to both of you for having me here today. I will be talking to you about the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP as we call it, a little bit about our work within the U.S. Department of Labor. I'll then share some work related to our youth policy team, which I lead up for ODEP, and then finally provide an overview of the federal landscape around WIOA, and in particular the provision within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, related to pre-employment transition services. Next slide. So the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, as I'm sure many of you know, we have quite a few acronyms within the government, so forgive me in advance if I use those acronyms instead of the full names. ODEP is a small sub-cabinet level agency within the U.S. Department of Labor. We were created in 2001, and it's important to note that we are a non-regulatory agency. So that means we are not enforcing particular statutes like, say, the Department of Justice or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Rather, we are in existence to promote policy and coordinate with employers and all levels of government to increase workplace success for people with disabilities. And we have as our mission to develop and influence policies that increase both the number but also the quality of employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So we have a Assistant Secretary position within our agency that reports directly to the Secretary of Labor, and we provide advisory services not only to the Secretary of Labor and other agencies within the Department of Labor, but also across the federal government and at various levels of government throughout the nation. Next slide, please. And this slide just talks about our priorities as an agency and how we do our work as an entity devoted to policy. We, as noted here, do quite a bit of analysis, research, and evaluation, oftentimes implementing demonstration grants on new and innovative strategies for increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities. We develop implementation tools and toolkits that are designed to help service providers at all levels in the implementation of new statutes and policies to improve employment opportunities. We develop policies, we conduct outreach and quite a bit of technical assistance. We have funded through ODEP quite a few technical assistance centers focused on various stakeholders within the disability employment community. And also we do a lot of collaboration, particularly at the federal level with other agencies, as I noted before, but also again through our state-focused work. Next slide. ODEP has 4 policy teams. I won't go into a lot of detail about the priorities of each of those teams, but I do think it's important to note how we approach this work with a little bit more detail. We have an employment-related support policy team. They're focused on housing, healthcare, technology, particularly accessible technology, transportation policy, new policies related to autonomous vehicles, and all of those supports that need to be in place for an individual to successfully be employed and to retain that employment over time. We have a workforce systems policy team which is focused on all partners within the workforce system. We have an employer and workplace policy team which focuses on both employment in the public sector but also employment in the private sector. And finally, my team, the youth policy team, which is focused on youth and young adults with disabilities as they transition from secondary environments into post-secondary education and employment. Next slide. So key issues that we focus on here within ODEP, notably the stay-at-work, return-to-work policies. This is a particular focus of the new administration, that is policy development related to ensuring that individuals who acquire an illness or a disability on the job stay connected to their job. We actually currently have a funding opportunity available through the Department of Labor in partnership with the Social Security Administration for demonstrating policies related to stay-at-work, return-to-work policies. Accessible technology, which I noted before, is a particular focus of ours, working with the developers, large companies, tech companies, on the development of technology that will help to ensure successful employment of people with disabilities, and two significant state focus related initiatives. One, the State Exchange on Employment and Disability, which focuses on intermediaries, so working closely with the National Governors Association, the National Conference on State Legislatures, Women in Government, and other entities to work with state policymakers to develop policies that will improve employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And our Employment First State Leadership Mentoring Program, which works with over 24 states around the nation, various state agencies including vocational rehabilitation, developmental disability agencies, mental health, education, labor, and others to coordinate in the development and implementation of policies that put competitive integrated employment first for individuals with disabilities. Next slide. And we have the focus area, of course, of youth in transition. And again, the guiding philosophy of our team here is to ensure that youth with disabilities are successfully transitioning from school or out of school settings such as foster care, juvenile justice systems, or other secondary environments into post-secondary education and employment. We have a long-standing focus on early work experiences and career exploration. We carry out that work through the support of a technical assistance center called the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. And all of our work is grounded in an evidence-based framework that articulates what all youth, including youth with disabilities, need in order to be successful. And that policy framework is called the Guidepost for Success. Next page. The Guidepost for Success, as I noted, is an evidence-based framework created by ODEP and our partners over at the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. And it's the undergirding philosophy of the Guidepost is that youth with disabilities are youth first. So when doing our work as a youth policy team, we look at what youth need universally, and then also what are the additional supports that youth may need in order to ensure their successful transition. And we've highlighted 5 things that encompass what leads to better employment outcomes: school-based preparatory experiences, career preparation and work-based learning experiences, youth development and leadership, so the opportunities to develop the self-determination, the self-advocacy, and the independence that we know are so critical to successful transition. Connecting activities like housing, transportation, health care, effective benefits counseling that will enable youth and their families to make the right choices for their post-secondary success. And finally, family involvement and supports. And I think it's important to note here that when we talk about family at ODEP, we're talking about the presence of a caring adult. We understand that not all youth come from perhaps a traditional 2-parent home, but we do want to make the point that having a caring adult in the life of a young person to help them navigate multiple systems is so critical to their later success. Next slide. And it's with that guiding philosophy, with the guideposts for success and our work as a team, that we work very closely with other agencies within the Department of Labor and also within the Department of Education on the implementation of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA as it's sometimes known, or WIOA as it's also called. This legislation was signed into law on July 22nd, 2014, and WIOA is many things, but what's noted here on this slide I really want to focus on because it's designed to help job seekers, including those with disabilities. There's a particular emphasis on disabilities within WIOA to access employment, education, training, and support services to succeed in the labor market. And it also has that dual customer focus, so it incorporates into its services for employers so that they too can get the skilled workers that they need to compete in the new global economy. Next slide. So as part of the reauthorization of what was once called WIA, or the Workforce Investment Act, WIOA amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And a couple of things to note here, particularly as they relate to youth and young adults with disabilities. One, and perhaps most important, is that it prioritizes competitive integrated employment within WIOA, and the guidance that you see emerging from our departments of both labor and education. All pathways are to lead to increased competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities. There also is a new emphasis on opportunities to practice workplace skills in competitive integrated employment settings before a young person departs school. WIOA also increases the population of students with disabilities and the types of services that vocational rehabilitation, or VR, can provide to both youth and students with disabilities. And then, and also importantly, it requires that VR agencies reserve not less than 15% of their federal allotment for the provision of pre-employment transition services. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about what's found in the parts of the statute related to pre-employment transition services. I'll be focusing on the context and what you can find in the language within the statute, and Mary will talk about those on-the-ground, real-life practices that we're seeing in action since the law has been passed. Next slide. So you'll note on the slides I've provided some citations for where you can find the guidance and the definitions, and at the end of the presentation there are quite a few resources related to where you can find more or answers to particular questions about what is allowable. But I do want to note several things here. The first is that pre-employment transition services, which has been called at times PREETs, are provided to students with disabilities who are eligible for vocational rehabilitation services or potentially eligible for VR services. So of note here, this means it can apply to students with disabilities, including those who have not applied or been determined eligible for VR services. So this really widens the net of who is eligible to receive these services from their state VR agencies. In addition, services may begin once a student requests or is recommended by personnel for one or more of the allowable pre-employment transition services, and once the VR agency has received the appropriate documentation of their disability. Next slide. So going into depth, I noted before that as part of that statute, the language requires that a state must reserve 15% of its federal award for PREETs for students with disabilities who are eligible or potentially eligible. I just want to note here that the 15% is of the federal award. That means 15% of what a state will get in its award, not 15% of what they draw down. So if you have a state where they're not drawing down their full funds, that doesn't mean that they're only required to spend 15% of what they draw down. They are in fact required to reserve 15% of what their federal allotment is. And within the pre-employment transition services, Section 113, there's an articulation of a set of required activities, a set of authorized activities, and then a set of coordination activities that can be covered as part of this new legislation. Next slide. So the required activities under PREETS, of which there are 5, are those that must now be provided to students with disabilities. And these 5 activities include job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, which can include school or after-school opportunities, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs at institutions of higher education, workplace readiness training to develop social skills and independent living, and introduction in self-advocacy, which may include peer mentoring. So again, these are the 5 required activities that must be provided to all students. Next slide. In addition to the set of 5 required activities that must be provided to all students, you now see within the law a list of authorized activities. So activities that may be provided if there are reserve funds remaining after all of those required services have been provided. And here you have a more extensive list. Activities that are now authorized under PREETS can include implementing effective strategies to increase likelihood of independent living and inclusion in communities and a competitive integrated workplace. It includes developing and improving strategies for individuals with intellectual disabilities and individuals with significant disabilities to live independently, to participate in post-secondary education experiences, and to obtain and retain competitive integrated employment. It includes providing instruction to vocational rehabilitation counselors, school transition personnel, and other persons supporting students with disabilities, so professional development here. It includes disseminating information about innovative, effective, and efficient approaches to achieve the goals that are articulated in Section 113. Coordinating activities with transition services provided by the local education agencies or the schools under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, developing model transition demonstration products, so where there is a state or local community that is doing something innovative in the transition of youth and young adults with disabilities, there are now the opportunity to fund additional programs or research into that. Applying evidence-based findings to improve the policies, the procedures, or the practices in support of personnel and in achievement of these new PREETS goals. Establishing new multi-state or regional partnerships involving the states, the local education agencies, businesses, importantly, and other participants. And finally, disseminating information and strategies to improve the transition to post-secondary activities for individuals who are members of traditionally underserved populations. And I want to note again here, so these are the authorized activities. So this is the set of activities that are allowable if there are reserve funds remaining. I'm going through the landscape of what is allowable, or the federal context of what is in existence now and being implemented by our departments. And then just in a little bit, Mary will talk a little bit more about what this looks like at the state level. Next slide, please. And then finally, what we see in the new statute is a set of allowable coordination activities. So these are activities that must be carried out and it is possible to use for a state VR agency to use that 15% of their reserve funds for these activities. And those activities can include attending meetings, the Individualized Education Program meetings for students with disabilities when they're invited. Something that's particularly important to us at the Department of Labor, working closely with the local workforce development boards, the American Job Centers, the one-stop centers, and employers to develop those work opportunities for students with disabilities throughout the year, and including apprenticeship as one of the options that is allowable. It includes working with schools and making sure that those are activities carried out under IDEA. And finally, when invited, attending person-centered planning meetings for individuals receiving services under the Social Security Act. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the vision that's being enacted by the Departments of Education and the Department of Labor as we continue to develop guidance and provide technical assistance around delivery of pre-employment transition services. I want to acknowledge that this is a growing field. There's been quite a few Q&As, question and answers, guidance documents that have been distributed, and towards the end of my presentation you'll see links to websites that provide additional information about the nuance of how we are deciding what's allowable under the different sets of activities. But guiding this push by the department is a deeply held belief about what works. And first, we know that having successful transition of all youth and young adults into competitive integrated employment really needs and requires that all partners are at the table and communicating in a shared vision of where a youth will go as they exit high school. We know that services have to build on each other, so it's notable that we often talk about pre-employment transition services as being part of a continuum of services that can now be provided to a student with a disability. And it's not one and done. There's something that can happen concurrently depending on what is determined to be the need of a young person. We also know and believe very strongly that providing these services in partnership with the families will help to improve the high expectations of both a young person for themselves and what they can accomplish, but also for that family member about what the life after high school can be. And finally, we have a particular emphasis on engaging employers in this process of determining what are appropriate work-based learning settings, what are appropriate work-based learning experiences that can provide access to career pathways for a young person while they're still in high school. Next slide. So why does this matter to us? I know that this is something that's quite familiar to the audience. It's why you all do this work. We believe here at ODEP and throughout the federal government, particularly our partners at ED and RSA, and within the Employment and Training Administration, or ETA as we call it, that we know that early self-exploration and career exploration, so that type of inventory of interest and exploration of self that happens during high school is critical to building a student's aspiration for what their life can be like after school. We also know from our research that giving students an access to a variety of experiences before they leave that secondary school setting can build their own skills, those soft skills and those workplace readiness skills that will make them that much more equipped for a competitive integrated employment setting upon departure or transition into post-secondary education from their high school. And finally, because statute can often be driven by what research has told and shown us and what the evidence is very clear on, paid work experiences have been documented to make a significant difference in the employment, the aspirations and earnings of youth with disabilities if they are provided while a student is still in high school. So again, we know from research, we knew this in the development of this new statute, that providing students with those paid work experiences before they depart high school leads to better employment outcomes once they've left. And that is in part why we believe so strongly in the provision of pre-employment transition services and are working very closely together and with states and through our technical assistance centers to provide guidance on what is allowable within this new law. Next slide. So there's several resources that are available to you, and certainly I know we'll have a Q&A period after Mary has delivered her part of the presentation. But I just wanted to note here that online you can find resources related to the work that we do at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at our website, dol.gov ODEP, but also through our Technical Assistance Center that is focused on youth and workforce development, and that information is noted here. In addition, next slide please, for the more technical questions related to implementation of WIOA, particularly as it's amended the Rehabilitation Act, and for delivery of pre-employment transition services, there are two TA centers that we want you to know about. The first, the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, or the WINTAC as it's called. The second, the Youth Technical Assistance Center, or the YTAC, are invaluable resources that provide quite a bit of detail and guidance both to VR agencies but also to youth service professionals and community service providers throughout the nation about how they can do pre-ETs in their particular communities. Now I think I will stop there. My contact information is on that next slide. I'm looking forward to your questions, and we'll now turn it over to Mary.
Well, hello everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I just want to make one note when you look at the slide with my contact information. Marie alluded to this when she introduced us. I have been a faculty member at the University of Kansas for just about 20 years, and I am retiring in a week, and I will be taking a position at Portland State University. So I thought for the purpose of this presentation, if you don't already have my contact information, feel free to use the Portland State email that I have available to me. Okay, the next slide, please. So what I want to just start with and try to bring it, my side of it, Taryn did such a great job with the policy side. What I'm hoping to do is share with you, because this is a session on youth transitions, some of the things that should be occurring while young adults with disability are still in high school and in 18 to 21 programs. And quite frankly, in my mind, a lot of what I'll talk about really starts at a very young age for students if we're holding true to the expectations that young adults will be successfully employed post high school or post their graduation from a post-secondary ed program. So just take a moment, and I want you all to just, because we can't talk to each other, just think about what do you think are the most important skills that you need as an adult, and then whether that really is different for a student with a disability, whether it's a learning disability or significant intellectual disability. So that's your 10-second pause. Because I always have a lot more to say than I have time for, I'm going to go ahead and move along. So when I think about this skill and when I ask teachers this skill, things that come up are often academic instruction that's tied to outcomes, making sure students understand their accommodations that they're using while they're in high school and how to advocate for those. once they're in either a post-secondary ed program or an employment setting. The school and work-based career experiences, and I'm going to talk quite a lot about that in just a moment. Interpersonal engagement, some of those adult roles and responsibilities that are so critical to adulthood, fiscal literacy, navigating your community. And then, of course, we often have post-high school programs for youth with more significant disability. What the research has started to say, what we know from my role as a transition educator, but also as a member of the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, which is the National Center for the school side of things, and we work very closely with WINTAC and YTAC. The evidence-based practices and predictors that are emerging, that if we want young adults with disability to be contributing to their community through employment, then there are certain skills and experiences they need while they're still in high school. So if they've been enrolled in occupational classes, they're more likely to be employed. If they have had a comprehensive work-based learning program, then that is actually one of the number one indicators of success. And parental expectations is another one that is equally critical to this process. So you can go ahead and hit the next slide. So, but before we begin, I'd like to just orient to when I talk about employment, what do I mean, and sort of clarify some of those outcomes that I think we're all hoping and working hard from a school perspective and then from the agency side to achieve. And so let's go to the next slide. And this is the definition from the Rehab Act of competitive integrated employment. This is sort of the gold standard for all of us, and it should be no different for a student with any type of a disability label. And as you read this, I've highlighted what I think are the most critical elements of it, and I've also given you a link to a really great FAQ that you can learn more about competitive integrated employment. So it is full-time or part-time. It's compensation at or above minimum wage, so we're not talking about piece rate or any type of a sheltered setting. It's receiving the same benefits in the same locations as employees without disability. And I love the last one, that there's opportunities for advancement. I think that's often something we forget about when we're talking about employment for individuals, particularly with more significant disability. We get them their job, and then we think that's their job for life, where all of us do continue to grow and want to expand our experiences, whether it's work-related or other. So let's go to the next slide. This is, and the supported employment, this definition, for many of you, you know it's been around, somebody could probably correct me, I believe since at least 1984, maybe 86 in the Rehab Act, when it was first offered as a set of rehabilitation services. So again, we see competitive work, integrated setting. It is for individuals with the most significant disability and who, because of the nature and severity of their disability, are going to need ongoing support services. So I would expect that many of you who are listening to this webinar are among this group because you may be providing that ongoing employment support services. And then the next slide. So the third one, and I pulled this, I believe, from the ODEP site. Taryn didn't mention that they have probably my go-to information on competitive integrated employment and customized employment is the ODEP website. So customized employment, it's not, it's a type of employment. I can't say that it is actually mandated in federal law. But it builds on what we know about effective practices for supported employment. So we're really targeting the preference, strengths, and interests of the job seeker, which I think is great because that directly mirrors what we find in the transition planning process. We all want a job that we are interested in and have some skills in, or some strengths in that domain or career pathway. And so focusing on that is a critical element of customized employment. You're typically using a job developer or an advocate, someone who sort of like is your personal representative. I just love that word, who's acting on your behalf to negotiate successfully with employers and to build a system of ongoing supports. That includes the formalized services that many of you provide, but it may also include natural supports on the job among coworkers and supervisors. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this sort of reiterates what I had said earlier about what we know that leads to employment. And if we want young adults with disability, particularly those with significant disability, intellectual disability, to be successful and to be employed post-school, what we know is most critical is work experience, and then more work experience. There should be multiple opportunities for young adults while they're in high school and in community transition programs to target all three phases of career development. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those three phases, but as a organizing framework, career awareness, career exploration, and career training. And it's nice that the pre-ETS services that are now allowable under WIOA meet all three areas of career development. If we want young adults, and you can tell that I do, we want young adults to be working in integrated competitive employment with the supports that they need, then really the most substantial factor to have that outcome is that while they're in high school, their work-based learning experiences are also in integrated settings in the community. We currently have no research to show that some of the pre-vocational tasks that occur in schools lead to post-school integrated employment. There are some things, a lot of school-based activities that can and do matter, but some of the traditional pre-vocational activities that are not in community settings are less likely to lead to outcomes. So next slide, please. I do want to share a really wonderful resource that has just come out, and actually NTAC, so that's the organization, the center that I have the opportunity to participate with. We have recently completed a webinar on a crosswalk of resources across the 5 pre-ETS priority areas. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a screenshot from that crosswalk. You can download this as a PDF, but it takes each of the pre-ETS areas, you see that over on the side on the left, and then it describes what or probably not what every state is doing, but what the prominent states who are most engaged in a high quality pre-ETS, and then it gives you links to the resources that they have available. So if you're interested in kind of digging deep into any one of the areas to learn more, and you know, what I appreciate is that I always want to know what other people are doing well before I try to attempt to do anything myself. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about each of the 5 pre-ETS. I'm going to give some examples of practices in the field, and I believe I have about 15 minutes, so that's roughly 3 minutes per pre-ETS, and so I have lots of information that I can share with you and give you the big picture, but I'm going to have to move fast. So when we talk about, you can go to the next slide, job exploration and career counseling, we're talking about those activities that help students explore career options and opportunities. So this is the career awareness component. We want to foster motivation and understanding of different options. The attention is focused on career decision making and how do we support young adults to begin to make those decisions for themselves. Once again, real-world activities, the relevance of high school. I think when students, for a lot of students who might be at risk of dropping out, once they understand that career pathway and how high school is relevant to their post-high school success, there's often a change in focus for that student. Again, we're talking about preferences, interests, and skills, and that we want to make sure activities occur along a natural progression with the goal being that the student is employed. So that is our sort of driving force behind it. And you can go to the next slide, and I'll share some of the examples of job explorations. And these are sort of a range of both some that are fairly easy to do, like career speakers. You can, if you're not able to get out into school, you can't take your class out on job sampling, let's say, you can still bring employers from your community in to talk about the different occupational areas that your students have expressed interest in, maybe by completing some interest inventories prior to identifying speakers. I'm a firm believer that whatever is happening in general education and in the typical high school is critical for any student with a disability as well. So career and technical student organizations, it's in my mind, it's much better to include students and support them in existing student organizations related to career or career classes than it is to create separate ones just for special education. Job shadowing, many of you probably know about that, those opportunities where students go out and they visit a couple of different jobs they might be interested in. More and more as I talk with practitioners, particularly in rural areas, they're starting to create innovative ways to job shadow that are virtual. And I think that that is a phenomenal approach to pushing in job exploration when your community may not support that. Let's go on to the next one. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going fast. Work-based learning experiences. This is the second pre-ETS that is possible. Thank you. So this is where we are really connecting what's going on in school. So when we think about the school-based learning and taking classes, engaging in the typical career activities that are occurring in the school, completing career assessments, the equally important part is how we then take those experiences and tie them to real-life work activities. This is where I think employers and community really need to be involved. So having school business partnerships where the business community understands that work-based learning in this capacity is a learning experience for students. If it's a paid learning experience, that's even better. But really the focus is on how can we bring the business community to support better prepared workers for the future. And so there's a wide range of experiences that are on the next slide. Again, lots of examples, some like career-related competitions. These are parts of what could be occurring within those clubs and organizations that are already occurring in school. Another example that I'm through Career Tech Ed, but another example that I'm familiar with locally is Job Olympics, where there's competitions around certain career skills that are occurring for students with disability. Informational interviews, I want to touch on that one because I find it to be so powerful, and that is where students themselves have an opportunity with a list of questions to go out and interview employers on the job and workers to find out if that job or career pathway is something they would be interested in. There's a wide range of other sort of activities listed here. I believe that service learning is a critical, we all know that a lot of when we volunteer or when young adults have opportunities to participate in maybe even some extracurricular activities that are not exactly tied to a curriculum, that those are often critical work-based learning activities as well. I do think that there's a limit, you can see on this slide paid employment, and I'm a firm believer in establishing through school business partnerships, internship programs where the community has internships that have been identified as relevant and available to high school students to try out. When I was in a community organization providing supported employment, we also established a paid internship program in our community so that we had really strong involvement from employers. There wasn't a guarantee that the student after the internship was done would keep that job, but we were able to build in some paid internships, which was a really exciting process. Okay, so let's go to the next area of focus. Maybe I can even slow down a little bit. So the third one is related to post-secondary educational counseling. Thank you. You can go to the next slide now. I appreciate that. And when I look at the list here, the focus is on post-secondary education. However, I think any one of these bullets are equally valid for young adults who may go straight to employment post-high school. And even academic planning, I tend to translate that up a little bit to early planning, and so which is a critical college and career readiness skill. So if we're working with young adults, maybe they don't know if they want to go to college or not, that part of their academic planning is around to plan ahead. And so whether that's to a post-secondary setting or to a career and an employment. You need a resume, whether you do that for a job or for a post-secondary, for a university or a community college application. You still have to turn in a resume in both circumstances. Some of the other bullets that are listed here are pretty self-explanatory, in terms of college affordability planning, the career exploration side of things. The one I want to touch on a little bit is accommodations and understanding the importance not only that students have accommodations while they're in high school, but that they understand those accommodations and they understand them as a support need, and that they're able to communicate with both a post-secondary ed setting as well as with employers about the specific support needs. So when we talk with young adults, we have a post-secondary ed program for youth with intellectual disability at KU, and when we talk with those young adults, we are encouraging them to understand it not from a disability need perspective, but from these are the supports that I need, and they practice understanding and being able to communicate that with the post-secondary ed services, but also with their instructors and with their employers. So it's a critical, probably one of the most essential on this list. Well, I guess I probably shouldn't say that, but I think it's a really critical set of skills that we often don't take to the next level of ensuring our students understand their strengths and also their support needs. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Looks like my talking quickly is going to pay off, but I won't slow down. So the fourth pre-ETS is workplace readiness for social and independent living. And when you look at the list that's been associated with the legislation and with the types of services that are possible, when I see this list, I've been doing a lot of research lately on college and career readiness, and every one of these is one of the characteristics of preparing young people to be college and career ready. It's also often called the soft skills or 21st century skills, employability skills. The importance of this set of activities, whether it's financial literacy or teamwork, is to have a strong understanding of where they occur best. If our goal is that our young adults are moving to competitive integrated employment, supported employment, customized employment, then the most likely place to practice, to have the opportunity to learn the skill and to opportunities to practice is in integrated settings. So in school, that would be within general education. So how we think about communication skills, particularly for young adults, high school students who maybe use an augmentative device or have very little verbal communication, working towards giving them the access that they need to a device, and then practicing in with others who are communicating is really important. And that's a skill that will generalize into the general community and into an employment setting. So, others of these, like financial literacy, a lot of high schools still offer coursework in the high school related to that, and there's also some nice curricula out there. And there's one that ODEP promotes, and I'm completely blanking on, Skills to Pay the Bills, which is a really great curriculum associated with fiscal literacy, financial literacy. Okay, let's go to the last one. And when we talk about self-advocacy instruction and peer mentoring, one of the things I haven't quite touched on yet is, if it's not evident from what I've had to say so far, that I think a tremendous effort within preparing youth for the transition to integrated employment and post-secondary education is being a strong self-advocate, understanding themselves, appreciating themselves, and being able to continue to advocate for what they need. And this includes the family as well. I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that family expectations matter, and they truly do, both for post-secondary education. Families who have high expectations for the future are most likely, their young adults are most likely to be employed and headed towards a post-secondary educational program. So continuing to work not only on the skills, decision-making, leadership skills, but equally important is that we provide the right opportunities for students to engage in using those skills. It doesn't make much sense if students are not able to be in the inclusive general environment, whether that's in high school or in the community, to be a self-advocate if they don't have opportunities to practice those skills. So as VR agencies and are allowing the focus on self-advocacy, one of my suggestions would be to check out the NTACT website. We have a series of evidence-based practices, and there's several instructional practices and curricula specifically related to self-determination and self-advocacy that have strong levels of evidence-based. Oh, and actually, if you go to the next slide, this is a screenshot of a toolkit that NTACT has put together with a group of, that maybe some of you on the call today, of experts. And what's really nice about this is, again, you can see on this screenshot, this one is about job exploration and counseling. And so it's a PDF you can download, and then each of these links take you to one of either the evidence-based practices that have been identified or predictors of post-school outcomes. And so this is all a research-based approach to offering a wide range of information to those of you out there who are practitioners and want to know about. I'm sure if you went to this document and went to the number 5, which is the training around self-advocacy, you would see a whole links to each of those evidence-based curricula that I had just mentioned. And my final 2 slides, my final slide is some additional resources. So I've given you the NTACT website and deep links into those toolkits and the crosswalk, as well as similarly to the other slide, the a deep link to the YTAC, the WINTAC, and also to the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability Youth. That's my go-to website for understanding from a programmatic perspective school and work-based learning and how the two are equally essential towards leading to a comprehensive program and integrated employment. And so if you go to the last slide, I put my presentation at more resources. Too many to go through, all of them. I don't claim that all these links still work, but every time a website changes, you can still Google it by the name of the organization or the agency. Okay, and then let's go to the last slide. And this to me is just, if you haven't figured it out already, for me, my belief and what I work toward hopefully every day is that we are preparing young adults for meaningful and successful and fully included employment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Taryn, for your presentation today. And Mary, you powered through your slides super fast. You're leaving us a lot of actually pretty good amount of time to address any questions that we might have from the audience today. So thank you for that. Just again as a recap, if folks joined us a little bit late at the start of the session today, we are recording all of the webinars. So if you missed anything from the earlier part, you'll get instructions from Anchor about how to download the webinar recording and the slides and today's captioned transcript. And then we have here the contact information for both Taryn at ODAP at Department of Labor and then Mary at Portland State University starting this fall, where she'll be shifting her career over from University of Kansas, and she'll be over on the West Coast later this year. But so while we're waiting for questions from the group, actually, here we go. So we have one question for you guys. Can any high school participate in the WIOA program, and how do they get approved or registered, and by whom? Taryn or Mary, can you one of you want to take a whack at that question?
I'm hoping Taryn will.
Hi, Taryn. Sorry, I started talking as I often do before taking myself off of mute. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes, if a high school has students with disabilities who are eligible or potentially eligible for VR services, then they would be able to participate in the delivery of those pre-employment transition services for those students. In addition, a high school can and is absolutely, we encourage that they work with their local employers and American Job Centers, often commonly known as one-stop centers, in the development of work-based learning experiences for students with disabilities as well. So again, if it's in regards to the delivery of pre-employment transition services for a student with disability, then absolutely. If they have students with disabilities that are eligible or potentially eligible, then they can. And the resource for that high school will be their local VR contact or the VR agency within the state. And I'll try to type it into the link so you'll have it, but one way to find that information is to go to, for your particular state, or federally, you can go to the website for the Rehabilitative Services Administration, and they'll provide contacts for each state.
The only thing I might add, I was going to add something, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, sure. Of course.
Okay, so the only thing I might add, and without knowing more about the person who asked that question, which is a really great one, is that every state is different. because each vocational rehabilitation agency has the flexibility to align with their state policies and the context within that state. You really do want to start with your state agency, and that resource that I shared around what states are doing really neat things would be a great place to start. I know, for example, in Alaska, part of their pre-ETS services, they hire high school teachers to do summer youth work. So they're using their rehab money in that way. Other states, rehabilitation services has counselors who might do a lot of the counseling and some of the activities, or they may contract with community agencies and community rehabilitation services to provide some of the pre-ETS services. So, it is a little bit of there's not a single method, and it's often unique to the state that you live in. So you do want to do a little bit of exploration to find out what's going on in your state, and then how you in your high school can get involved in partnering with what that state is working towards.
I think that's a great point, Mary. We often say at the federal level that if you know one VR program within a state, then you know one VR program, because there is a lot of variation within the state, similar to Medicaid, for example. So great point.
So this is Marie. And thank you for that. So I have up on the slide the crosswalk that you're referencing, Mary, right? This is the NTAC crosswalk, is the one we're talking about, that each state has its own program. Mary?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I was on mute, of course. I think there is a WINTAC website that has links to state agencies to start.
Okay.
This would be a way, like if you're in Alabama, then Transition Unlimited is providing some of the pre-ETS services, and you can get connected. But, in Florida, Project 10 may not be the only agency providing career development or pre-ETS services in Florida. So this will give you some ideas of what's going on in your state. And if your state's not listed, that may be indicative of the sort of the starting up of pre-ETS services within each state. They're all kind of in.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm done.
Sorry, Mary. I was just going to say, just to follow up on what you said, there is on the WINTAC website, if you go to the website, the link is provided by Mary. There's a whole section on pre-employment transition services, and one of those sections in the resources, there's a drop-down menu that gives you access to frequently asked questions, promising practices, similar to what you see on the screen related to what's going on in the states. And they also have a resource section that goes into more detail about what is actually happening in all of those states. So that's exactly right. You can find that information through the WINTAC under the topic area, pre-employment transition services.
Awesome. Thank you both for clarifying that. I think that would be a really helpful resource for our folks. The other question around the pre-ETS is there a specific age or grade that you recommend beginning pre-ETS? Is that high school, or is it younger, or can you clarify?
I'll let Mary maybe talk about it from a research perspective, sort of best practice, because it differs by state.
And I hate to take out I was frantically not having my technology work, and I took out the slide I had about when it officially starts. Is it 14 that rehab can get involved? Is that correct?
14, yes.
Okay, 14. So what I would say is, according to current policy guidance, it's 14, which could be 9th grade, it could be 8th grade. From a research perspective, it's preschool that you want to be working with families. But if at a minimum, I would say middle school. And most middle schools now are doing things like every kid in 6th grade takes some type of a career assessment, or they're a part of a portfolio. You know, schools are starting to build out all types of ways to build that the college and career readiness focused skills early on. And so first finding out what's going on in your high school, middle school. I would say by middle school you should really be thinking about it and starting it, and a lot of the career awareness activities can be occurring in middle school. And then high school is where I think you have to really hit the ground on career exploration and career training.
Something else I wanted to note, sorry, Marie, is just that on the website that we both referenced, the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth, there are a whole set of resources related to individualized learning plan and the process of doing career development, career exploration, and self-exploration. And we often advocate as a policy office that the earlier the better, and provide through that website, NCWD Youth, a whole set of resources related to exercises that you can be doing at the middle school level and the high school level, and even in out-of-school settings with students and youth with disabilities to help them begin that aspiration development and development of skills related to work. Cannot emphasize that enough, how important it is to do it early and often.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I highlighted that. Those are the website for folks' reference that's on the screen right now. Do we have any other questions for either Taryn or Mary? We have about 15 minutes, so we have some time here to kind of dig deeper if folks wanted to ask some more specific questions from either of the presenters. Just send them by chat. While we're giving folks some time to kind of think about additional questions they might have, Mary or Taryn, is there anything that you folks wanted to kind of clarify? You did kind of, we wanted to make sure you covered all of your key points, but you know, we have a little bit of time here, so I wanted to make sure that you guys had an opportunity to kind of reinforce some key messages from your presentation, some key takeaways that you wanted to make sure folks walked away from today's session with.
Off the top of my head, without going back and talking through all my slides again, I guess what I would say is if this is the first session you've attended where pre-ETS has come up, that's really great. It's probably the most exciting new development that is possible. And so I would think you want to really explore and partner with your state and local agencies, because whether that's at the school level or on the employment side of community services and vocational rehabilitation. You know, I think people are, depending on where you are philosophically or with the services that you provide, some folks are way out at the front end of it and know what to do and have great ideas about the types of services that they can contribute so that young adults are successfully employed. I think others probably are still trying to figure out and shifting what they're currently doing to a more inclusive and focus on integrated employment, and how do we best prepare young adults with evidence-based practices that we know are effective. And so that's a pretty wide continuum, and you may fall somewhere in between that, and that's okay. And the important thing to do is hopefully we've been able to provide some resources and materials and further conversations that you can have in order to promote and ensure that every student who has been identified in special education or is a rehab eligible for rehab services is getting the most that they can possibly get to be successful.
And I would just add to that, I see that there was a question that popped up related to best practices for developing relationships with potential employers in the community. So combining that question with a reflection on some of the things that we might want to clarify, I would note again two things. One that Mary referenced and went into some detail about is the resources related to customized employment and the discovery process that are available on the ODEP website. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that we have a whole host of materials and an initiative focused on employment first and working with states around the country to help in the development of employment first policies. And a key aspect of that work is helping providers to understand and implement the customized employment process, which is a process that involves both the individual with the disability, but also really strong relationships with employers themselves, and through that job development process, understanding what needs they have to be filled. So in part, I'd answer that question by directing you to our website at odep.dol.gov/ODEP and looking at the Customized Employment Toolkit, which as part of its resources talks about how you can do that employer engagement activities to meet the needs of both individuals with disabilities and employers. I would also note that because we have a policy team focused on both employer and workplace policy, that we have guides and resources related to employer engagement. So again, on the ODEP website, which is listed here on the screen, that top link, there's a whole section called Employer, and there's some employer engagement toolkits around developing relationships with employers. We also have something called the Employer Assistance Resource Network, which in addition to being a technical assistance center for employers themselves, also provides information related to the development of relationships with employers that lead to better employment outcomes. So a lot of resources within the resources that we provided on the slides. And certainly as you're going through this information, and if you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out using the contact information. As I said, my focus area is on youth, but we have a whole host of subject matter experts on a wide range of activities, including customized employment, competitive integrated employment, and employer engagement that I'd be happy to connect you with here at ODEP or within other agencies.
Thanks, Taryn. Yeah, I think that's probably, I put up your contact information here because I think there is a lot of resources on the ODEP site and WINTAC that you guys have both referenced that we're not going to be able to dig into here. So I want to make sure that folks know that they can reach out to you both after this webinar, and over the next few months or so, as they're starting to kind of get into pre-ETS content, and get into the weeds of pre-ETS practices and so forth. I think with that, it looks like we don't have any additional questions from the audience, so I think it looks like we can probably conclude today's webinar at this point. And then I would just encourage folks to, when we send out these slides, if you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Here's all of the contact information for our presenters, and then as well as your contacts for TASH and ANCOR if folks have additional questions as they're kind of digging into all of these resources when we send out these slides. I promise all of these hyperlinks will be working, and you guys can kind of take a look at this stuff at your leisure. But at this point, I think we can go ahead and conclude today's webinar, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Ruthie Beckwith at TASH, Taryn and Mary, our presenters, and then all of our participants for listening in and being part of today's webinar on youth transition. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It was great to join you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.